thank you all. Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out today, and thanks Del and all the other people, and Jimmy, and the other people who put this amazing film together. There's a lot of politicians throughout throughout our history that have talked about the border issue as a way to stir up or to encourage or incite xenophobia or racism or nationalism or all the other kind of alchemies of demagoguery. And I come to this issue from a different place, from a different perspective, and it's a perspective of compassion, of humanitarianism, but also just common sense. A country cannot exist if it can't secure its borders anymore. Any more than a cell can exist if it doesn't have a coherent membrane. The kind of everything, the borders are one of the definitions of our country. And we need to close them. And as the Border Patrolman, who was the former president of the Border Patrol union and the head of the Border Patrol in that area, he said we need high fences, but we need open gates. We need to change our immigration policy to make it coherent, to make it sensible, to make it serve the interests of our country. Right now, it took me, when I went to the border, it took me 3 days to really comprehend what was happening there, because it was so strange. And you heard me do the interview with a woman who ran a healthcare center, where she said, and when people come across, many of them do not have the money. They've been stripped of their money by the cartels. One of the things that immigrants do is they get robbed, they get exploited, they get extorted, they get raped, they get robbed. All of these, we saw people who talked about kidnapping, which is endemic on the border, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, the smuggling of all these drugs, the methamphetamine and the fentanyl that's coming across, and then the destruction, this assault on the local community where people told us that they wouldn't let their children out during the daytime because they couldn't go play in the yard because they were scared of these strangers that were running across their yard, fleeing from the Border Patrol, which is a very common occurrence there. We visited a hospital, the local hospital. The local people in Yuma were, as I said, they were the representative of the best in our country. The local hospital told us, the director of the hospital, that that hospital had lost $27 million the previous year in unreimbursed expenses caring for migrants. And they cared for migrants. They let migrants come into the emergency room or into the maternity ward at the same basis that they did local people. So relative, the wife of the head of the hospital had scheduled an inducement for her pregnancy, to end her pregnancy, I think it was a C-section, and could not get in because there were 35 immigrant mothers who had filled up the maternity ward. And we saw this all over the city of Yuma, where people were going out of their way to care for the immigrants with compassion. But the community itself was under assault, and this is now happening in communities all across our country. This week, the New York Times had an article that said that 90,000 immigrants had landed in New York from this giant flow of 7 million immigrants over the past 3 years that have come across illegally, 7 million. Compare that to the 3.1 million who entered legally during that period. So twice the amount of immigration is coming across illegally. And we are not managing as a nation our own borders. We have shopped that function out to the Mexican drug cartels. We're making billions of dollars controlling US immigration policy. And all of the carefully constructed immigration policy that we had in our country is meaningless because drug cartels are deciding who gets in and who doesn't. The immigrants and the New York Times article talked about how the tsunami of new immigrants of 90,000 people were crushing the social service systems in New York City. Bloomberg carried a recent article that talked about how officials in New York City are now considering turning Central Park into an open-air migrant facility or migrant camp. So this is the level of crisis, and we talked to people. I did a tour of Cleveland and Harlem in the last couple of weeks. Some of the Lee Harvard neighborhood in Cleveland, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods, and the black-owned business owners and local people were talking about how they could no longer access the Social Security or the social services of their city because they were overwhelmed by migrants. The city of Miami has done probably the best job in our country of reducing homelessness over the past 30 years. They have a model program that's worked. They've reduced homelessness from 7,000 people to 1,000. But now all of that progress is being reversed by the flood of immigrants that is pouring into Miami. And then what happens to these people? Those 7 million people who have come here now, there's 16 million altogether. 7 million in the last 3 years. What happens to them when they get into this country? Because this is supposed to be, many people in my political party believe that we've adopted this to reverse the cruelty of the Trump years and to have a humanitarian policy that is welcome to immigrants. But what happens to these immigrants once they cross that border and they engage? They endure all of the abuse and the rapes and the sex trafficking and the kidnapping of their children and the robberies. We talked to Peruvian families that their life savings was removed from them just before they crossed the border. So they go through that, and then what happens to them when they come into this country? They are still liable for labor exploitation. That's their lives. They are now illegal. There is no way that they can legally work in this country. They cannot support themselves. They cannot pay taxes. Everything they do, we're creating this understory of exploitable poor that will be exploited and will impact the price of labor and the wage of labor for every other American, every working American. These people are being paid by unscrupulous employers $5 or $6 an hour, and that's their lives here now. And there's no way they can change that. They have no leverage. They have no bargaining power. And I spent a lot of my lifetime interacting with Cesar Chavez, who was one of my father's closest political allies and then became a very, very close ally of mine on the pesticide issue. Over the last 20 years of his life, he became the primary actor in this country, one of the primary activists against farm pesticides, agricultural pesticides. And I worked with him very closely on those issues, and I was a pallbearer for him when he died in 1993. Cesar Chavez was one of the biggest champions in our country, probably the lead champion at that time, for a closed border, because he knew that American farm workers could not make any gains in terms of their wages and their benefits, their quality of life, if there was an endless supply of new workers, undocumented, coming across the border who lacked the bargaining power to be able to ask for higher wages from their employers, because the employers could always use the threat of exposing them. We have a policy now that is not serving anybody's interest. It's not serving the interests of Democrats or Republicans. It's not serving the interests of our country, clearly. It's not serving the interests of the migrants. And it's not serving the interests of our neighbors to the south. Everybody is getting hurt by this policy. The good news is that it's solvable. We can stop this. And, I will say this, that I was against Trump's wall. I thought it was a crazy idea. To me, it was a big mistake. My sister did a prize-winning documentary called The Wall, showing all the reasons we shouldn't build it. And I don't think we do need a wall, as we were told, for that 2,200 miles between Brownsville and San Diego. But we need something. And a lot of that technology was in place. We have the towers, we saw them. Some of those towers were removed, which is incomprehensible to me. We had the cameras, we had the videos, we had the lights, we had the ground sensors, the motion detectors. We can protect our borders. We have the capacity, the technological capacity to do that. We need the willpower, the political willpower to do that, and we need the personnel, and we need to do that for our country. We need, number one, we need to restore those barriers, and again, they don't all have to be physical barriers. We need some barrier so that we know everybody who's crossing. We know every single person who's crossing. We can do that. And if we have the personnel, we can stop that. More importantly, we need to be able to process legal asylum seekers. The one category that comes across the border undocumented are people who are fleeing political persecution. And we have a capacity, we have a methodology for processing those claims. What we should be doing, and what we used to do, is we would process them at the border. And only 15% of them are adjudicated as legitimate. The rest of them, the other 85%, are adjudicated as specious. And then under normal conditions, the specious claimants are not allowed into this country. They're turned away. If we were doing that today, the entire business model for the cartels would collapse. Because these immigrants who are coming into it, and let me tell you first, what happens to the immigrants now is most of the immigrants we saw that evening, none of them were even, only 2 families said they were fleeing political persecution. The rest of us just told us openly, we're coming here to make money. We're coming here for a better life. So they didn't even have that claim. And those immigrants shouldn't be allowed into the country. We should stop that at the border. And it's the reason but what happens is that they're all given court dates. And the first court date is an arraignment type. It's an arraignment in front of the immigration courts. Because we don't have enough judges, it's then a 7-year wait to get a hearing. So those immigrants are allowed into the country. They attend the first hearing, and then they legally go and wait for 7 years. They can't work, but they're in our country legally, and they put down roots. And we don't really know. They become part of this underground economy. And what we should be doing, and the reason we have that is we don't have enough immigration judges. We don't have the capacity to process those claims. And we need to do that, and we need to do it quickly. We need to be able to process them at the border and make a judgment right there. And the people who do not have legitimate asylum claims should not be allowed in, should not be allowed to cross. As soon as we do that, the immigration is going to stop. Because if you put yourself into the shoes, and we talked at length with these migrants, these are people who have clearly spent years and years thinking about doing this. This is a huge decision. This is the most important decision in the lives of these people. They're deciding to root themselves up, to leave their families, to leave their jobs, their income, to take their children with them and move to a new country with no plans at all. Imagine what it takes to do that. Well, they're making a risk assessment. And if they know that there's an 85% chance that even that 85% chance that even people with asylum claims are going to be turned across the border, and a 100% chance that if you don't have an asylum claim, you're going to be turned back. Not many of them are going to take that risk, and the business model for the cartels will collapse. So we need to be doing that. And right now, when we interviewed these groups coming across, this was one of the sort of shocking but interesting things. They knew every step of the way what was going to happen to them. Nobody was surprised. They knew exactly what to do because the cartels advertise all over the world using TikTok and YouTube. And they give videos to people to show them exactly what they do when they come in through Nicaragua, where a lot of those immigrants were flying into Mexico City. The cartels assist them in getting an internal visa in Mexico City for Mexico. Then they get on a domestic flight to Mexicali. And then in Mexicali, there's a parking lot filled with buses owned by the cartels. They load in 55 people per bus. They can separate families there, and parents never see their children again. In many cases, I don't know what happened to that gentleman that we met in the processing center in Yuma who had lost his 18-year-old daughter, but it's frightening. And then they are brought by the cartels to the border. We can watch those buses then unload across the border, and the people come across 55 at a time. And the cartels are making billions and billions of dollars doing that. And the people know because they are advertising in West Africa, in Ukraine, in Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Tibet, and China. So everybody knows how to do it. And of course, this is a huge industry now. Usually they pay the cartels up front $10,000 to $15,000 a piece. But if they show up with money, they may also get robbed on their way. And we heard a lot of those stories. So the last thing that we need to do, the first is finish the technology and the physical barriers, which are almost complete. And those only need to be in the urban areas, in places where there's high population densities, and then in the remote areas and wilderness areas, we need to put the technology, the surveillance and motion detection technology, and the cameras, the towers, and the lights, and the videos. And then the last thing that we need to do is to change our relationship with some of the countries south of the border, to bring them into a partnership. This trail of immigrants is not good for them, and it's destabilizing. And today, our relationship with the Mexican government is at a low, and we need to improve that relationship and bring them into a partnership with us in stopping the flow of immigration. So these are all things that I'm going to do immediately. This is going to be one of my highest priorities as soon as I get to the White House. We can stop this, and we need to do it for our country. So thank you very much.